everyone to our final episode on the contemplative arts and aesthetics of yoga. I am Dr. Pravina Rodriguez, faculty at Star King School for the Ministry in Oakland, California, and postdoctoral fellow at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University in Berkeley, California. Today we have with us Vitoria Price. She is going to be talking to us about the contemplative arts and the aesthetics of digital Darśan. Vitoria Price is a PhD student at the Center for Dharma Studies at the Graduate Theological Union. She is a historian and social scientist of Hinduism in the United States, whose research focuses on the development of Hindu movements in the US since the late 18th century. Her area of expertise is the intersection of religion and technology, specifically focusing on how Hindu groups in America employ the internet to connect with practitioners and how Hindu individuals employ technology in their ritual practices. Victoria is also a digital marketing professional specializing in strategy and design for social media platforms. Along with Victoria, we have with us our very own Dr. Rita Sherma. Dr. Rita Sherma is founding director and associate professor at the Center for Dharma Studies, core doctoral faculty, department chair of theology and ethics, and co-chair of Sustainability 360 initiative at the GTU in Berkeley, California. Dr. Sherma has served as vice president of the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies. She is the author or editor of 8 books and is the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of Dharma Studies, Asian and Transcultural Religion, Philosophy, and Ethics. She has recently co-edited a 34-chapter volume titled Religion and Sustainability, Interreligious Resources, Interdisciplinary Responses with me, Dr. Pravina Rodriguez, and Dr. Purushottama Bilamoria. The volume is published under the Springer Nature United Nations Sustainable Development Goals series. She serves on the advisory board of the Yale Forum for Religion and Ecology and has filmed 2 documentaries on spirituality and sustainability under the GTU-X initiative. Before we begin, I would like to invite Dr. Sherma to say a few words about the project, and then we will have Victoria present for us. Over to you, Dr. Sherma.
When we think of contemplation, we think of sitting quietly in a room and meditating. That, of course, it's a contemplative practice, but so is art, so is liturgy, so is dance and drama and painting sacred images, sacred sound, hymnology, and now with the advent of the global pandemic, increasingly it has become about presenting all of this and sharing all of this online. And how do you do that? How do you have an embodied contemplative praxis in community or alone as a participant or observer online? And for that, we have with us Vitoria Price, and I will let her tell us about it. Victoria, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for this invitation. I want to start by thanking, of course, Dr. Rodriguez for hosting this talk, and Dr. Sherma for providing such a wonderful outlet for the lectures that have been part of this project. I'm so honored to be included in this, and thank you for the invitation and for welcoming me to this space. So I'm going. So my topic for today is digital and ritual contemplative aesthetics. So let me begin by discussing what aesthetics means, specifically in the field of digital religion studies. As the field of aesthetics has reincorporated religious artwork into the fold, returning more toward an Aristotelian aesthetic and away from a Kantian aesthetic, the field of religion and media, at first and then now digital religion studies, are really broadening the understanding of what aesthetics can mean when we're talking about different forms of technology. So things like audio recordings, mass-produced lithographs and photographs, and even works of art that only exist on web pages or other digital spaces, and things like NFTs in our current times. And just as a reminder, right, Kant's understanding of aesthetics was very rational and cerebral, and he essentially left out the senses and the body in his understanding of the beautiful and the sublime. On the other hand, Aristotle's understanding of aesthetics is very embodied, and it incorporates the analytical with the sensorial. So the field of aesthetics, as it interacts with the study of religion and tech, is getting back to the place of incorporating the senses rather than relying strictly on rigid and cerebral analysis. So when we talk about aesthetics in digital religion studies, it includes both visual and non-visual media. Of course, there's generally a bias toward the visual in many studies of digital religion, especially early on in the discipline as it began in the 90s, because the technology just wasn't there in the beginning to include anything other than text and images online. So now that digital technology is rapidly advancing on an almost constant basis, there's the potential to really study more than the visual. And when we're specifically discussing aesthetics in digital religion or online religion, you can now talk about other senses. So think about the quality of an audio recording and how it feels to listen to the transmission of a prayer, for instance, through your headphones or through a speaker, whether you're alone in your bedroom or your meditation room or in public, in like an amphitheater. Or how does it feel to hold a device in your hand? Or what is the usability of an app, and how does that impact the experience that you're having when you're using something like a prayer counting app in place of mala beads or other prayer beads? So we can think about how those sensorial experiences with technology compare to an experience without technology. We can begin to look at how the contemplative practice is altered depending on what materials, either technological or otherwise, are being used during the ritual. So as technology advances and as the study of digital religion tries to keep up with all of these changes, we can bring more of our senses into the conversation and broaden the understanding of what aesthetics means in the digital realm. Now, before I go any further, I want to very quickly review the 4 hermeneutics that Jessica Fraser discusses in her article, Arts and Aesthetics in Hindu Studies. These are, of course, artifactual, iconic, embodied, and transformative hermeneutics. And these give a really good foundation to discuss how aesthetics are studied in digital religion, especially in this case when we're talking about contemplative ritual practice. So first, the artifactual hermeneutic comes from an archaeological background. Its framework analyzes objects in relation to the society in which they were created. So it takes into account the resources that would have been available to the craftsman, first of all, what kind of person or group would have commissioned the creation of the object, what the popular artistic styles of the time period were, the social and economic structure of the place where it was created, and all of these kinds of things. So it's very historical, very anthropological. Next is the iconic hermeneutic, and this one is very straightforward, right? Basically, using this hermeneutic, an object is analyzed as a physical representation of the theology that's presented in a text. So in this understanding, every part of the icon is representative of a piece of its story. So think about the goddess Kali, for example. She's most often represented in iconography with her dark black skin, her bright red tongue, and her gleaming white teeth. All of these elements have specific theological significance. So when the image is analyzed with the iconic hermeneutic, we look for those elements because they appear in her sacred story. The third hermeneutic that Jessica Fraser identifies is the embodied hermeneutic, and this sees the object or the image as the manifestation of a deity. So in this case, the aesthetic analysis describes the object not just as a representation of the deity's theology, but as an actual embodiment of the deity. And last, but certainly not least, is the transformative hermeneutic. And in this view, we look not so much at the object itself, but at how the object affects the observer. So studies using this hermeneutic talk about the intersubjective experience that occurs between the object and the spectator. So these studies might talk about the sensorial experience of a devotee viewing a murti that's on display in a very pristine, quiet museum setting, as compared to viewing a murti in a temple in like a very busy, buzzing city area. So now that we have that reminder of those hermeneutics, how do they translate when we talk about Hindu rituals and contemplative practices that incorporate tech or other digital elements? And this is where things are all very context dependent, right? So using the iconic hermeneutic, for example, things can be pretty straightforward. The digital icon, as it appears on the phone or computer or whatever device, will still be representative of the theology of the deity, whether it's a photo of a murti that exists in the real world, like this one that's located in Thailand, or if it's a murti that's designed by someone on Photoshop, right? So with digital images, the same creative process that's involved in crafting a murti out of clay or metal or stone is still engaged through the graphic design and illustration process, but obviously through a different medium. The theology is still represented in the image, it's just shown as a digital illustration instead of a carved or forged three-dimensional object. Now let's think about the embodied hermeneutic. When we think about the practice of darshan, for example, this very intimate process of simultaneously seeing and then being seen by the divine, it takes on a different feeling when the embodiment of the divine is viewed on the screen of a phone or a laptop or what have you. And this is something that Nicole Karapanagiatis discusses in her article on Vaishnava cyber-pūja. In the contemplative practice of darshan, it's very intimate. It's sitting with the divine, right? Gazing into the eyes of the divinity and then feeling the sense of the divinity gazing back at you. Generally, the object that's being used for devotion is a murti that's made out of various materials, or sometimes it's a photo of a guru or a saint or a respected historical figure. The idea that's so central to this practice is that the being that the devotee is communing with and connecting with, whether it's God, goddess, or guru, is embodying the object they're gazing at. So when the object of devotion is a photograph or an image on a laptop, for example, the sacred being is theoretically embodying the image in the digital realm and also on that specific device. So this is where some practitioners start to have trouble with incorporating technology into the practice because of issues of ritual and aesthetic purity. In an experience of darshan in a temple setting or sitting at an altar at home, the object of devotion is something that sits on the altar and nowhere else. It has its clean space in the ritual setting. Its seat is taken care of and attended to regularly to ensure that it remains ritually pure, so it's always ready for worship. However, in the sort of cyber-pūja that Karapanagiatis describes, the object of devotion is viewed on this electronic device, right? And it's also used for work, school, and leisure activities. This is the same laptop that we watch Netflix on, you know. And so in the cases that she describes, the representations of Shiva in particular, in her work, they're being viewed on an active web page that's also used, or that also includes advertisements and other non-ritual elements. So in that way, what would be the object of devotion is seen as impure because the medium it's being transmitted through is not strictly used for ritual purposes. So in addition to that, we also have issues that the icon or the object of worship has not been ritually imbued with the divine. And what I mean by that is that it hasn't undergone the ritual of prana pratishta. And in this ritual, the object, which is most commonly an iconographic statue, right, a murti, is consecrated as a seat or a dwelling place for the divinity. So going back to Jessica Fraser's hermeneutics, this is the perfect example of a contemplative praxis that's easily analyzed through the embodied hermeneutic. Before the ritual takes place, the object is a beautiful icon. It can be easily respected for its beauty and its ability to showcase the theology of the divinity, but it's not necessarily something that would be used for worship at an altar. After the ritual, however, it's believed that the object is then a sanctified and appropriate place for the divinity to sit and be worshipped when the practitioner is at the altar and ready for prayer. During a typical worship experience, one of the first steps after ensuring that the space is cleansed and ready for prayer is inviting the divine to embody the Murti on the altar, calling the divine into that space. And that's why prana-pratishtha is so important, because it designates that Murti as an appropriate place for the divine to dwell during worship. And so when the Murti is seen on the screen, the question arises whether or not prana-pratishtha needs to be performed every time the image is opened, and whether or not the device needs to be ritually cleansed before opening the image and placing it on the altar. So because of the necessity of these extra steps, some practitioners will simply say that including the digital into their praxis is just too much, it's not doable. Others will say that the extra purification steps are permissible, and they'll do things like wipe down the computer before opening the web page or the image. They'll place sacred ash or kumkum powder in front of the computer to purify it. And some people will even place sacred chants or prayers on the computer to invoke the mood of sanctification on the device before opening the image and placing it on the altar, like you can see here. Outside of altar worship, an attitude of embracing the technology available to practitioners rather than either strict attachment or avoidance has seemingly made its way into common practice. This is evident, I would say, in the embrace of digital or virtual practices like watching festivals online or on television, calling or IMing one's guru for guidance from across the world, and listening to a guru's lecture that's been uploaded to a streaming service and is then available for download or for viewing. So going back to the practice of darshan, the famous leader of Siddha Yoga, her name is Guru Mayi, she's been using the internet and satellite technologies to stream her communal gatherings for years. And at first she was marginalized by more conservative or traditional groups for her acceptance of technology. But over time, it's become far less taboo because with more practitioners spreading out across the globe, and technology is advancing to the point where video calls and live streaming are easy to set up and participate in, it's become more commonplace for spiritual leaders to use the internet specifically to connect with devotees. Especially in the last 2 years, of course, right, more traditions have embraced technology as a part of their practice because it was necessitated by the pandemic. And one tradition where this embrace was particularly necessary and also a little disorienting for practitioners is the global group that follows Amma. Her full name is Mata Amritanandamayi. She's wonderful. Amma has a very distinct way of communing with her devotees and engaging in the practice of darshan. In her case, darshan is more than sight. It's more than just gazing at her devotees. It crosses the boundary into physical touch, as you can see in these photos. Her style of darshan involves embracing devotees in a hug, and she quite literally holds space for those intimate moments with her devotees. And her name, Amma, translates to mother, so many of her devotees look to her as a spiritual mother. And as such, the hug that she offers in her practice has a very distinctly maternal feeling. Based on my own ethnographic experience at her temple in San Ramon, the ritual practice of both holding and being held by Amma is very emotional for many people. When I was conducting my research during her visit in summer of 2019, countless devotees were in tears and physically trembling after their embrace. So when we talk about the aesthetics of the practice, being in the temple, smelling the incense and the flower garlands that she and some of her assistants were wearing, feeling the embrace of a being that you consider highly sacred, hearing her chant a mantra in your ear as she's rocking you back and forth in her arms. All of these elements contribute to the intensely sensorial experience of participating in this ritual. So what does this very physical ritual look like when you move it from a face-to-face interaction to a face-to-screen interaction? Going back to Jessica Fraser once again, right, we can use the transformative hermeneutic to ask, how does the online ritual affect the participants as compared to the in-person ritual? And in asking this question in particular, I need to explain something called ritual transfer theory really quickly. This theory was developed by a team of researchers at the University of Heidelberg, and it recognizes that rituals are dynamic and ever-changing. It posits sort of like a Goldilocks principle of transferring ritual from one context to another. According to Christopher Helland, the adapting and changing process can be described by three heuristic components of transformation, invention, and exclusion. Transformation is the process of shaping or reshaping a ritual that already exists, changing its content or structure in certain ways so it can be facilitated online. For that process to proceed, there may need to be innovation within ritual based upon the new media environment, and new aspects may have to be invented to allow for the ritual to work in cyberspace. And then the final element is exclusion, since certain things inevitably have to be left out of the ritual in order for it to take place online. So basically, if you change it too much or too little, it'll be unrecognizable to practitioners in the new context, and the transfer of the practice will fail. Returning our thoughts to Amma now, right, and thinking about her intensely physical and sensorial practice of darshan, I want to discuss how the practice has been altered to provide a meaningful and enriching experience for practitioners in a virtual space. Amma has a fairly regular online broadcast that's live streamed through YouTube. I think this September 27th, 2021 may have been her last one. She hasn't done one in a while. But if they're live streamed through YouTube, the links are unlisted unless you make an account on her website and register for the specific Amma live broadcast that you'd like to attend. So you can't just view them on YouTube. The recordings don't exist online. And so I attended one of these broadcasts in May of 2021. And the program that I viewed was being broadcast from her ashram in South India. She's in Kerala. And that was where she was staying during the pandemic. I think she's still there. The stream opened to a view of her seated on a platform in the worship space in the temple. And she spoke in her mother tongue, which is Malayalam, and a translator who was seated just below her read a translation off of a tablet that he was holding. So both of them, her and the translator, used microphones and speakers to ensure that people could hear them both on the live stream, and then they also had an in-person audience who was there in the ashram. In the first part of the program, there was a guided meditation that began by Amma striking a gong that was just behind her. And she instructed everyone to turn their attention inward and focus their thoughts and energy on healing, right? That was the big theme. She invited everyone to imagine flowers of peace falling in different places, like rivers and lakes and mountains. And then they showed a graphic of like animated flowers falling from the sky. And then after the meditation ended, she did a Sanskrit chant and struck the gong again to mark the end of that period. And then they played a pre-recorded video, which was very interesting, of Amma speaking about the importance of selflessness and not exploiting nature. And then once the pre-recorded video ended, the video stream returned again to Amma sitting in the ashram. She chanted more Sanskrit verses and then was joined on stage by a devotee who presented a sermon. And then once he finished, the group began singing bhajans. And they were singing and dancing, and it was very joyful. And that was the moment where there was a clear, it was very clear that there was a significant group of devotees gathered inside the ashram, because there all of a sudden there were many voices that were not present before. The bhajans lasted for about 20 minutes, and then the program ended with devotees praying directly to Amma, making offerings of incense and candles and flowers, and reciting prayers again. And then Amma gave sort of like a gesture to the audience in the ashram, and then also to the camera, to give hugs and kisses. She made those gestures because she couldn't actually hug anyone, even those who were gathered in the ashram. And then she was escorted off screen and the service was over. So obviously that experience was markedly different from the in-person ritual practice. There was no incense in the air, no physical commute from your home to the temple. For me, in my case, I only had to go from the living room to the dining room. There was no bumping elbows with devotees as we shuffled through the space. No small talk. They had the comments turned off on the live stream, so you couldn't interact with anyone if you were watching from home. As a transformative aesthetic experience, it was far less engaging sensorially than being at the temple. And of course, the biggest loss in that transfer was the hug. That's the biggest part of her in-person worship, is being able to have that communion with her, that physical experience. However, there is still a transformative experience of actively choosing to log into that account and view the live stream while it's happening. So unlike many things today, like I said, there's no recording available after these services are over. So there is something very special about that experience, despite lacking many elements that make up the in-person worship services. So with that sort of retelling of my experience, let me wrap up here by returning to the reminder that aesthetics and digital studies of religion tend to focus on visual elements, but I hope I've shown that there's room to grow in this kind of work, especially when doing comparative work. There are endless possibilities for expanding what it means to study digital religion with an aesthetic lens. And as new tech continues to emerge, the field of study will only get more diverse, and I really look forward to seeing what kind of wisdom is uncovered. So thank you again for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you so much. That was so enlightening. I have so many questions, but let me begin from, I want to go backwards and then we'll come all the way back to Amma. The first thing I wanted to talk to you about is you began your presentation in reference to Aristotle's perspective. And I just thought about his essay Poetics, which is the first essay written on literary theory. And in it, he defines art in all its modes, be it like song, dance, poetry, etc., as imitations of nature. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things, that Hindu ritual is often an eco-spiritual praxis. It brings in the 5 elements of the archetypal 5 elements that you see in all ancient traditions and civilizations. It brings in flora and, trees and all manner of natural ingredients, makes yantras out of seeds and lentils. And so there's so much of fire and water and so forth, and even rituals that are actually done in forests and in sacred groves, under trees, at river sites, sacred rivers. It's a very eco-praxis oriented ritual tradition, or embodied praxis tradition. And that will also be missing in this context. And I wanted to get your sense of that because, puja itself is basically involves all of these elements. and one can do it at home. But if you're participating in a puja at a major center, there's, at home you have a little candle or a little diya. You go to a major center or a temple or a puja on a sacred river, and there are these massive diyas, several layers high, and it's an experience. Just the flame swinging through the air, it's an amazing experience. The touch of water, the touch of sacred water sprinkled on you, which you're not going to do to yourself, or if you do, it feels weird. The flowers that are flung, not just by you, but by others onto the altar. So all of these things that are missing, that you touched upon in the segment you did on Amma, I want to bring it back to the context of actually participating in puja, and how you would, you spoke about Jessica Frazier's artifactual, iconic, embodied, and transformative perspectives on this. And I'd like you to kind of go back to that and see what is lost in terms of equal spiritual praxis in our digital environment engagement with liturgy and puja.
Certainly, yes. I mean, you've really hit the nail on the head. There is quite a bit lost when you are not in the physical environment that a lot of these practices are based in, right? If you're not sitting on the shores of the Ganga, it's not the same, right? Even if you have that water like shipped to you or something. One sort of creative option that I've seen to sort of start to overcome this issue is almost like care packages, like spiritual care packages. People will get like the materials shipped from India or from wherever their home temple is, and they'll have them shipped to their house, so then they can engage with the materials in their own home and have a similar sensorial experience, but obviously not quite the same. I've also seen people sort of do like a pseudo, what do I want to say? Like instead of walking outside, like do a walk around the neighborhood and then end up back in your meditation room in your house, and so, do that.
Like a pradakshina around the neighborhood.
Yes, right. And so that they have that sort of transformative experience of getting up and moving outside of their normal home environment and then ending back up in a ritual space, so that you enter that space in your mind. So there are a few creative ways to kind of get over that. But of course, unless you're physically at the space in India or wherever, it's not going to be the same. But people are certainly trying their best through inviting those sensorial experiences into their homes, really filling the room up with incense and all of the candles that they have, right? Playing the music on the speakers, playing the chants as loud as they can to really fill the room up with that sound and that smell to get them into the contemplative mood that fits the practice.
That's fascinating. You mentioned, the alteration of the mind, which is kind of necessary in this context. It's up to you. In other words, whereas you would be carried by all of those sensorial ingredients, all of people, all of that energy around you, the dynamism of the liturgy, you essentially have to be the agent that alters consciousness or awareness yourself. Is what I'm hearing you say. Like there's more effort, and that it makes me think of the visual you gave us, which was very interesting. That was sent, shared with you by someone of a Devi puja and a Devi altar with a digital image of the Devi right behind. And I was thinking that, well, it's this idea that we're discussing, the idea of your own control over your own mind, that the power of that is actually in, invoked in the tradition with with the concepts of visualization, which is very, very powerful in the tradition. And that is in a context of ritual, that visualization is very well known in Manasa Puja, and when we think of Manasa Puja, it's interesting because you can perform Manasa Puja anywhere. You can be on a plane or a boat, it doesn't matter. The idea of Manasa Puja is twofold. It is to train the mind to be able to have that kind of disciplinary control to elicit the presence of the deity, the presence of the divine, without having the material and visual culture, not even the digital culture, nothing, just the mind. And so the idea is that, I'm going to just go back to one particular issue that you mentioned about prana pratishtha. How do you do prana pratishtha for digital image? You spoke about that very eloquently. And I was just thinking that, how do you do prana pratishtha of an image that doesn't even exist in physical reality, not even in digital form, not even in virtual reality? And that again brings you back to Manasa Puja. And thinking of a particular Manasa Puja I'm very familiar with, for example, Shiva Manasa Puja is a good example, it's very common. And it starts with the Ratnai Kalpita Masanam Himajini. Okay, so what it's saying is that then Snanam Chadivya Varam. Now, think about the words are so amazing. It says that I have mentally formed, I've mentally formed, it says, kalpitam, a seat, asanam, with jewels, made of jewels, ratnai, a bath for you, snanam, with cool water, himajalayi, and with divine garments for you, adorned with various gems, and sandalwood paste, chandanam, mixed with marked and stamped. And it goes on like this, the fragrance of musk, and an arrangement of flowers, pushpam, that I have prepared, rachitam. It just goes on like this. And so that then it ends up by saying that, may all that I have imagined in my heart for you, O Lord, be accepted by you, that you make a home in this space that I've created for you. So it's like an intensive visualization, naming every step that you would do in a regular puja, that you are expected to visualize absolutely in absolute perfect detail. And we see this in not just the Hindu tradition, we see it in Vajrayana, we see it in Tibetan Buddhism. When we go to museums and see sand mandalas being made, right? And it's so intricate, right? And they're making it from memory. And so it's this idea of memory and visualization that I think speaks to this digital moment. If you can create prana pratishtha for the image of the divine, which doesn't exist in virtual or actual reality, you can most certainly do it with digital virtual reality.
Absolutely.
You actually have something, right? So I think, from what you said, what I thought you brought out so well is the idea of the possibility of this being for a solitary practitioner, in communion with the divine. A contemplative praxis is completely possible, and the digital world actually can assist in that and enhance it. But if you're looking for a liturgical experience in a congregational communitarian setting with others and the energy that carries with it, I think that we're at a loss. Would you agree?
I would completely agree. Yeah, I think the inclusion of digital technology into ritual practice is specifically very helpful for people in the diaspora, people who don't have access to big temples. Like I'm here in Michigan, we don't have many Hindu temples in the Midwest, you know, so these kinds of things are just not very accessible to certain groups of people. It also grants more accessibility to disabled people who might not be able to travel to the temples, or might not, or might be overwhelmed by the sensorial experience of being physically in a temple, you know. So it opens a lot of doors for these communities. This Mata Amritanandamayi that you're talking about, I'm very familiar with it, of course, but it has me thinking now of how the act of creating a digital image could in itself be a contemplative practice, of how beginning with just one single pixel on a web page or one single dot in Photoshop or something can then be a contemplative practice of building the icon in the digital realm from memory, or having the text open in front of you. In a PDF even, we'll get even more meta with it, right? Have the PDF of the text open and then reading alongside this image that you're creating, and using that as a completely digital contemplative practice to commune with the divine in that way. And then it's so personal, right? Because you're creating your own icon in that sense. So there are lots of possibilities for creative experimentation with digital iconography, especially in the diaspora.
Well, I think that's what you just said. I mean, that's so evocative, because the whole idea of all of these contemplative aesthetics is really a transformation of consciousness. It's a transformation of awareness.
Mm-hmm.
How you transform awareness, it doesn't matter. It's you know, as a result, in these cases, as I said, with solitary practice, it can actually really aid. And it also becomes, you know, for example, you know how people use bija mantras to create an entire image. The whole image, it's like pixels. If you look at it from a distance, it's a beautiful image. You look at it closely, and it's made up of bija mantra written with different shadings and coloring.
Exactly what I was thinking.
You know, so it's there in the tradition in a different form. Mm-hmm. So what a rich conversation. Thank you so much, Vitoria Price, for illuminating this complex and fascinating and really important issue going forward, because I think it will be transformative for a tradition that is so deeply situated in embodied praxis. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.